On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, I speak with my colleague, Lee Sondeno, about F. Scott Fitzgerald and the 100th anniversary of his great novel, The Great Gatsby. Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of the official podcast of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, Uncommon Sense. I am Joe Grabowski, the VP for Evangelization here at the Society, joined by my colleague, Lee Sondeno, who is VP for Operations with the Society. Hi, Lee.
Hi, old sport. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald, his novel, The Great Gatsby, which readers of that novel will have caught the reference there in Lee's greeting, and kind of how Fitzgerald relates to Chesterton, both in kind of a positive way, maybe in a critical way too, and kind of how all this ties into a theme that we're kind of focusing on as we approach our summer conference, which is in New Orleans. So, just a nice confluence of events that we have the 100th anniversary of Gatsby coming up in April, and then our summer conference in the birthplace of jazz. And so what better time to discuss the great jazz novel, right? So Lee, what about your background with reading Fitzgerald? So what makes you so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, well, I was an English major, which makes me a professional in anything related to literature, and only other English majors will get that reference. But I did spend a lot of time taking modern American literature courses, especially the Lost Generation. And one of the characters that always stuck with me was F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm not quite sure why, if it was maybe just kind of the darkness of F. Scott himself, his religious background, but he always struck me as a really interesting character during a really tumultuous time in the United States, the 20s and 30s. And like you just referenced, I think it's, you and I were talking a couple of days ago, it's so interesting that we're, as a society, are going to have our conference down in New Orleans, which is really the birthplace of jazz, Congo Square and all of that. But it's the birthplace of really the music that helped define that generation, the 1920s and 30s. And I would say, again, maybe it's as just an asterisk here, I'm no F. Scott Fitzgerald authority or scholar, but I would say that not only jazz, but Fitzgerald's writings really did define that generation in the 20s and 30s. So maybe we'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit, kind of talking through some of the interesting points that Fitzgerald makes about the 20s and 30s, and maybe how Chesterton relates to some of those things as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, as a quick teaser for that and for the conference, this is sort of, I think, providing extra fodder for discussion at the Afterglows this summer, alongside one of the great talks that we're very much looking forward to at the conference, which will be delivered by Mark Barnes of New Polity out in Steubenville, who's going to be asking the question, was Chesterton right about jazz, and should we agree with him? Chesterton, not a big fan, let's just say, of jazz.
Right. So maybe
But
we won't tackle that one. We'll leave that for the conference. But there's plenty else to.
indeed, yeah, we can talk about sort of the jazz age and what that was, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because I sort of assiduously neglected American literature in my own studies. I was a philosophy major undergrad, but have my master's in literature. And you had to kind of choose focuses, and I chose the two British periods, which was essentially basically 600 to 1688, and then thereafter to the modern period. And obviously that was because I wanted to focus on Chesterton and Belloc and the kind of Catholic Renaissance in literature over there. But one of the figures I became very fascinated in and consumed all his writings and did a lot of research and scholarship on him was Yves Lenoir, who in many, many ways is sort of a British parallel of F. Scott Fitzgerald. So I think we'll have a lot
Very
of interesting things to talk about
Yeah.
as we move forward. Where would you like to begin? Maybe just introduce the listeners to who Fitzgerald was. There's so many funny kind of serendipities here with this conversation. One being where you're recording from now. Not a native there, but yeah,
Right.
tell us a little
Right.
bit about
So
Fitzgerald.
very, very, very excited about that for sure. So we'll talk about that. But I think just to kind of go back to the podcast as well, and kind of talking through some of these literature icons. I know we'll be talking in a couple of weeks about another icon in literature, in American literature, specifically related to the region of New Orleans that we're really excited about. But what's really interesting about Fitzgerald is not just the person, but this year actually marks the 100-year anniversary of when Great Gatsby was published. So, I had an interest in that. I also had an interest in the fact that I now live in the Twin Cities, and I came from the New York City area. And I must confess, Joe, that one of the first things I thought of when I was moving to the Twin Cities was, well, Fitzgerald was from there, so it shouldn't be that bad. But he was born in 1896 in St. Paul. To an upper middle class Catholic family, so he grew up Catholic. He was baptized Catholic. His father went through a couple of different jobs. He never really had a steady income as long as Fitzgerald was growing up, which is why they moved back and forth many times between St. Paul and a couple of different areas in the United States, specifically New York State, until Fitzgerald got a little bit older, and then he ended up going to the New Jersey area. But his mother was from kind of old stock riches, right? So they always had an income. They always were able to live this wonderful middle class life, just on some of the inheritance that his mother had received prior. So he really. It's interesting when you think about Fitzgerald, because he had this sort of Midwest, cultivation of life and family and virtues. But then he also grew up in an age where, again, a tumultuous time in the 1920s and 30s, where you can really see kind of him breaking away from a lot of those virtues and from family, which went on to, I think, define him later on in life. And we'll get to that in a little bit, I think, when we talk about Zelda and some of the things like that. But I'll just give you a couple of fun facts. He was named after Francis Scott Key. He was a distant cousin of his. Francis Scott Key, of course, is the one who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. So Fitzgerald's official name is Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. But a lot of times that's completely cut out. He's known to epitomize the Jazz Age. One amazing quote that he has is with this era was, he defined this era as growing up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, and all faiths in man shaken. So you have to remember that back then, this is 1917, 1918. This is when the Great War had just happened, right? And there's a lot of this post-war mentality of freedom, a lot of post-war. I think America is trying to decide where it is in the world. It's trying to decide what it holds dear for values and virtues and things like that. And that's really where F. Scott Fitzgerald is kind of caught in the middle. And I think it's interesting, the parallel between Fitzgerald and Chesterton. So Fitzgerald was born in 1896. Chesterton was, I believe, 1874. Joe, is that
Yep.
right? Somewhere around there. So even though there's about 20 something years separating the two, they were really considered contemporaries. And what's interesting is they're both considered kind of these models of moving past the Victorian era into this sort of new era. And I don't know if you have any take on that, or how Chesterton felt about kind of this new era and jazz and things like that. I know you were pulling up a couple of quotes related to jazz, and we don't want to get too deep into it because of the conference. But what's your sense about kind of Chesterton moving from this Victorian era into this sort of modernist, consumer driven age that Fitzgerald found himself in as well?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest point of connection here probably would be actually in Chesterton's distributism, in that he recognizes sort of these new forces, you know, and he's not wholly critical, like Chesterton is not as critical, let's say, as some of the hard nosed kind of romantic Victorian types about the nouveau riche and this sort of new rising middle class structure. You see this sort of dealt with in Downton Abbey, for example, if you're a fan of that TV show. Of there's
Awesome.
there's this loss of we speak of that generation, the lost generation,
Yeah.
coming of those young men that served in the war, but really there's sort of two big losses, right? Because there's something before that. The sinking of the Titanic is another one of these kind of moments where,
Sure.
in something of the old way is passing, um, and it's passing kind of blindly, because of sort of the march of progress and the march of industrialism. And it is that very same, machine driven march of progress that makes World War One the horror that it is, right? When World War One starts, guys are going out into the lines, in some of the same uniforms that they had worn in the Napoleonic Wars. They're very much in the same kind of strategies of alignment. But by the end of the war, you have huge machine gun batteries, you have tanks, you have the barbed wire trenches, you have gas being used. All of these just new things that are another kind of darker side of the results of industrial capitalism. So there is this, despite all his criticisms of what he sees as a product of this development, Chesterton, and we can talk about some of those criticisms, I think. Uh, there is this actual sympathy that he has with the lost generation. I just don't know that he would have kind of recognized that, but their aimlessness. There's this great quote that I pasted into our notes, and it's just one little verbal exchange in the Father Brown story, very late in Chesterton's career, 1935. In the Scandal of Father Brown, there's a story called the Vampire of the Village, where a doctor says to Father Brown, "I don't enjoy this jazzing and joy writing of the bright young things." And the bright young things are Evelyn generation, the Fitzgerald generation in
Sure.
England. And Father Brown responds, "The bright young things don't enjoy it. That's the real tragedy."
Hmm.
And I mean, you can't read Gatsby, for example, without really, really resonating with that observation. So again, I think that even though Chesterton approaches it from a critical point of view, the crisis, the very modern crisis, that is captured in modernism, uh, the psychological crisis of J. Alfred Prufrock, right?
Yeah.
That's what
Sharing my
you're,
life in coffee spoons, right?
yeah, that's
Yeah.
what you're finding here, and it's great to compare these authors who, again, I think, from an ostensible reading, have nothing to do with one another, although you'll get
Right.
into where they actually do. But just their sensibility that there's something in the 20s happening that's just so fast, and it has this kind of centripetal force. It's pushing out
Mm.
from the center.
Yeah.
Again, William Butler Yeats' great line, "The center cannot hold," right?
Right.
In uh, the oh gosh, but the poem just ran out of my mind. What poem is that from? The "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold," "The Second Coming,"
All
by
right.
Yeats. Yeah, that's this kind of critique of society that's happening on both sides of the pond,
Yeah.
in writers as disparate as F. Scott Fitzgerald, G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, and even people like J.R.R. Tolkien in a different
Right.
way. So,
Right.
yeah,
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I think, the lost generation that you alluded to, of course, that included, people like Hemingway and Faulkner and all of these, T.S. Eliot as well. They all approached the lost generation mentality a little bit differently, and I think that's what's so interesting about Fitzgerald is he seemed to have leaned into it a little bit more than some of these other authors. You even look at Hemingway and the way that he portrayed war, especially when you're looking through The Sun Also Rises and some of his other kind of post-war novels. It's pretty grim, right? And it's pretty gritty. What you're seeing though in Fitzgerald is sort of the opposite. He really does kind of lean into this culture, and he becomes the epitome of the culture, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit here. But he always has. It's interesting that you bring this up about the center not holding, because he always has sort of a spiritual center in his life, and this is where we'll get to Great Gatsby and a couple of the characters, including Nick Carraway. Is that it's always the Midwest? It's always St. Paul, right? It's always here for some reason. And no matter where he finds himself, so whether it's in Princeton and things are failing and he's got a love who doesn't love him back, which is the reason why he joined the army in the first place, right? Was because he he had a girlfriend, and the girlfriend didn't like him, and he was so depressed, almost suicidal, that he decided to join the army. Um, but he always comes back to St. Paul. Even when his family moved up to Buffalo, New York, and things weren't going well there, he ended up back in St. Paul. Even with Zelda, and his marriage, and kind of the opulence that they were living in New York City, when they even had children, they went back to St. Paul to have the children, and then moved back to New York City. So it's pretty interesting that even Fitzgerald's able to sort of navigate inside of the culture that we're seeing, this jazz age that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But he's always going back to kind of that center, or at least he's still trying to find it. And I think that's what's great about the Great Gatsby, is he really epitomizes this, through these characters, how he's trying to get back to that center, but he almost can't find it. And to your point, things change so rapidly that it was almost gone. And I don't want to skip too much to the end of the discussion, but that's almost where Chesterton describes, right, what is man without virtue. And at that point, if virtue is gone, then where are we? And I think that's where Fitzgerald maybe found himself, was he was always searching for that virtuous side of himself, and couldn't find it again. And maybe that's because he grew up Catholic, maybe because he had these spiritual roots. But I think it's kind of interesting to look at how all of those things kind of correlated in those different characters of the Lost Generation. We do know as well that Fitzgerald was a reader of Chesterton. I think a lot of the Lost Generation were readers of Chesterton. Even Hemingway references him in a couple of short stories. But Fitzgerald specifically did write about Chesterton. And as a matter of fact, in his first novel, it's pretty interesting, This Side of Paradise. So after the army, when Fitzgerald moved back to St. Paul to finish this great first novel, which was a huge commercial success, by the way.
Hmm.
So Fitzgerald himself was pretty young when he wrote this novel, and when he released it, I mean, this was at the cusp of the jazz age. It was a huge commercial success. It really put him on the map. But he references Chesterton there. Let me see if I can find it here, and it's pretty interesting. So he's got a character that's, again, what's great about Fitzgerald is everything he writes is kind of semi autobiographical. So all of his characters have to do with himself and his life, and things like that. But when he's talking about a couple of different there's a Arcady, right? He's talking specifically about Arcady. He's talking specifically about these other characters that are wanting to go to Princeton, and he mentions that this character he read voluminously all spring, the beginning of his 18th year. So he's reading all of these books, including The Man Who Is Thursday, which he liked without understanding. Which I really think is so great, because even
Familiar, yeah.
familiar, right? As Fitzgerald kind of putting this into the character of This Side of Paradise, saying, well, he obviously read the book, and that's probably was his feeling of A Man Who Is Thursday, was that he read it and he really didn't understand it. But again, I'm no scholar of Fitzgerald, and I haven't seen a lot of writings around this, but I think the parallel of those two books, of Man Who Is Thursday and The Great Gatsby, are something that I'm looking forward to talking with you about as well, because I think it's kind of an interesting parallel between the two. And you hear the school bell here. I'm in the library, but yeah. So I think we should talk about maybe what the jazz age is, and what that
Yeah.
means. So again, the jazz age, jazz started in New Orleans, but it was really ramped up in the 1920s and 30s. It was wrapped into this kind of prohibition type of thing. So there was a lot of bootlegging back then. There were a lot of speakeasies back then, and of course, being the popular music that jazz was, that's where you found the jazz was in these kind of illegal places throughout the country. But it was F. Scott Fitzgerald that really popularized the term of jazz age. So it had existed many years before, but it was Fitzgerald who specifically in 1922 wrote a short story collection called Tales of the Jazz Age, which really just solidified that yes, we are living in the jazz age right now. This is the 20s and 30s, and it was the early 20s that he mentioned that. It's called American classical music for a reason, because it was created in America. It was about as American as you can get. I don't think there's any other reference across the pond or anywhere else that had any music similar to jazz. And again, we don't want to take too much of what we're going to talk about at the conference related to jazz. But I think the important thing to remember is that the jazz was considered responsible. The New York Times said this back in 1922 when Fitzgerald had kind of coined the phrase the jazz age. They considered jazz responsible for the decline of Western civilization. specifically the music.
Hmm.
Not
Yeah.
everything else that was going on, but specifically the music. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And again, Fitzgerald really leaned into that. So after he left St. Paul, after he did a short stint in the army, he was in Princeton for a little while. He ended up moving to New York City, and he and Zelda. So he met this other girl named Zelda Sire that he ended up marrying, and I think they got married at St. Patrick's Cathedral, as a matter of fact. But she was not Catholic. She was Episcopalian, I believe. Um, but they really epitomized this kind of Jay Z Beyonce type of couple, right? They were the ones who there's images that people have written about they would see Zelda and Fitzgerald on top of taxis riding down Madison's Madison Square Avenue, and they were drinking on top of these taxis. They were doing handstands instead of hotel lobbies. Whenever they found a staircase, they would always slide down the staircase. I mean, they were absolutely rambunctious couple. Um, and what's interesting at this point in time, and why I bring that up, is because we're talking about kind of Fitzgerald leaning into this jazz age and really just epitomizing what it means to be part of the jazz age with these lavish parties that he was throwing, the money he was spending, the drinking, the gambling. And it was here at this point, after his commercial success with his first novel, um, which was again written in St. Paul, but he lived in New York City at the time. Shortly after that, was that he realized, Fitzgerald, that he would never be this happy again, and it was
Hmm.
this realization that came down to him of, well, I'm living in this opulence, like I'm living in kind of the center of gravity of this jazz age, and I'm never going to experience this kind of height, this elevation of happiness again, and it really depressed him. And I think it's interesting when you think about that, and maybe there's maybe a Chestertonian spin that you can that we can look at here. But it's as you've built up this kind of false god of satisfaction, and then Fitzgerald himself realizing that this isn't going to last long. And then
Hmm.
after it's gone, there's not going to be much more, because he didn't have, again, the center of gravity where he was able to kind of lean back into. And to him, this was it. So Fitzgerald at that point really kind of did a 180. So instead of leaning into the jazz age, he started to be a little more critical of the jazz age. And that's where the Great Gatsby comes in, because, if you're familiar with it, that's a work where it's not necessarily it's not nice to the jazz age. It's not nice
Hmm.
to a lot of the characters. You're reading through them, and at the end of the book, you're thinking, this is actually really depressing. These people are not real people. There's just artificial, superficial, all the way across the book, and that explains itself so well in Fitzgerald's attitude about the age, and that attitude about, there really is nothing beyond this. I've reached the peak, and I'm not going to see anything else. And just a quick question for you, Joe. So, what was your? Did you read Gatsby in high school at all,
I
or was
did,
that
yeah.
okay?
Read Gatsby in high school, and of course, subsequently thereafter, as I started to sort of make some of my inroads into literature scholarship, and it it is such just an epitomization of the era. One of the things I kind of played with early on, reading it, writing some essays, was the rhythms of it. How the jazz age, we might take for granted how the influence of music on prose and upon poetry, arguably, of that era, is not incidental or coincidental. It is
Mm,
very much part of a deliberate kind of um, cross hatching of the cultural moves that are being made by very clever people, and Fitzgerald would be one of them. And so you get in when you read Gatsby. By the way, viewers and listeners, you can pause here. You can go and read the book. It'll only take you a day. Spoilers ahead, though. I just
spoiler
want to
alert!
say that. Spoiler alert,
It's
big
only
one.
100 years old, but spoiler
Yeah,
alert.
just in case. Don't watch the Leonardo DiCaprio movie. Read the book.
Yeah.
But you know, the staccato rhythms of jazz are sort of punk there, and the improvisations,
Mm,
and arguably because they are improvisations to a certain extent, they're unmoored from uh, maybe a grander theme. The resolution, if it comes about, is almost kind of like found or discovered in the process. This is
mm,
the conversation style in these rooms. again, I have to cite Eliot in the room. The women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. Like, what's he talking about in Prufrock? There, he's talking about this sort of veneer of culture over vacuous conversation.
Mm.
And if you want to read another great novel that
Put it.
captures this, again across the pond, Yves Lenoir writes Vile Bodies,
Mm.
and that's where he becomes critical of this sort of culture, the bright young things that he's a part of, and the bright young things become vile bodies, which is from the Anglican burial service. They're the dead alive. They're just
Mm.
walking around as basically hollowed out individuals. So I find it to be an immensely powerful and compelling book, and I know that that's not, some people think that it's a bit pat or on the nose. I don't think so. I think it just captures so keenly the felt experience of a whole generation,
Yeah.
and it really is a treasure to any student of American history, any student of certainly American literature, but really of British literature, as I am, will benefit from revisiting this novel from time
Yeah,
to time.
yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting too because people that I've talked to, of course, it was required reading in high school, and I think there's a couple different camps. I don't know if people necessarily don't like it, but there's people that love it, and there's people that like Fitzgerald's quote about a man who is Thursday, read it, and they don't quite understand what it's about.
Yeah. Hmm.
So there's these questions around what do all these characters mean, and we're going to get into that a little bit, some of the symbolism and why I think it really is just a kind of a counter novel to Man Who's Thursday, which of course was written much earlier. But
Hmm.
yeah, The Great Gatsby. We're at 100 years. It was his third novel, so it was published in 1925. It was an absolute commercial failure when it first came out, which I think is really interesting, and what kind of played into kind of the downfall of Fitzgerald is, he had this really commercial success with This Side of Paradise, his first novel. He put himself on the map. The Jazz Age short stories put him on the map as well. He had a lot of other stories that people were really eating up Fitzgerald. He was becoming one of the great American authors back then. Came out with this kind of obscure book called The Great Gatsby, which, again, remember, this is a turning point for him as well in his attitude about the social norms of the time and how people were just becoming obsessed with the self gratification and really wanting to separate. He was really wanting to separate himself from that.
Hmm.
So Great Gatsby is released. It only sells about 20,000 copies the first year. I remember looking this up as well. Only 40 copies sold in 1940, the year that Fitzgerald died. 40 copies. So I think today its numbers are around 59 or 60 million copies worldwide that are sold. So this was a success that didn't happen until much later in Fitzgerald's life, but something that constantly haunted him. He thought he was a failure as a writer. He didn't think that his life had amounted to anything because he was seeing the decline of his career after Gatsby was written. So I think just reading Gatsby in that lens of during the time of Fitzgerald, it was not that popular of a book. And it could be just because it was sort of a counterculture book, right? People would read it and think, "Oh, this is the great Jazz Age author writing something else that's interesting about our times," and it kind of ends on a down, and I think people probably read into that and were pretty cynical toward the novel because the novel was cynical toward the American dream.
Hmm.
And that's really, the bottom line of what Great Gatsby's talking about. But it is considered a masterpiece now, and it's a contender for the Great American Novel. And there's probably some people that are going to be putting a lot of comments about that in the show. But it still is a contender for the Great American Novel, and I would argue for that. I think just the way that it was able to encapsulate the time, this amazing transition period for America. I don't think there is any better novel that can be described during that period of time. But again, like we talked about, it's very autobiographical. We've got some key characters, including Nick Carraway, who's, again, with his Midwestern roots. He's narrating the story, and he's looking at all of these other characters kind of through this lens of, I'm a visitor, right? I'm looking at this from the outside, and through a lot of the symbolism through Great Gatsby, you can see at the very end of it, there's these great lines that Nick Carraway talks about as, wanting to go back to the roots. And if you're, a fan of St. Paul, Minnesota, there's an amazing little paragraph there that talks about just the wonder and the beauty of the snow of St. Paul, and the streets lined with with street lamps and just kind of this down home quietness that he wasn't seeing in New York. That's such a juxtaposition of the rest of the novel, and it really is one of those beautiful parts of Gatsby where you can see Fitzgerald through the character of Nick kind of wanting to go back in time, and that's always kind of a theme for Fitzgerald, is kind of wanting to go back, even though he was leaning in and going forward at the same time.
Hmm.
And most people know this. So, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, right, was written by Fitzgerald as well, and I think he plays on a lot of these themes in that short story, in that novelette, where you start out old and then you die when you're young, which is kind of this permeating theme. I think that he is sort of discovering in Gatsby as well. Is, if Fitzgerald could have lived all of this opulent life earlier on in life and then kind of had discovered his Midwest roots later, he would have been a better person for it.
Hmm.
And I think that's what he's kind of getting at. But the imagery used, we've got the Valley of Ashes, which is kind of this transition from East and West Egg to New York City, where they have to pass through this Valley of Ashes, which is just an incredible kind of imagery there of, like you talked about, sort of uh, the dystopia of America at that point in time, and the world after World War One. We had a lot of people that were starving, a lot of people that were trying to find jobs. There was the industrialization of the age, and that's really where this Valley of Ashes comes in. Is that's where the lower class live, right?
Hmm.
That's where the real people live, in kind of this really dark, dirty sort of atmosphere. And then you've got kind of the two rising sides in this valley. You've got East and West Egg, where Gatsby lives and where Daisy lives, and then you've got New York City, which is just the definition of opulence. And then in between both of those things, right, you've got of course, the T.J. Eckleburg eyes, right, that are always referenced in the novel. And we were always taught in high school that those novels probably represented just this idea of your sins will always find you out, right? And I think
Hmm.
it's interesting because Fitzgerald, at one point in time, he was talking to an editor, and for his third novel, he said there's going to be absolutely a Catholic element in this novel. It's debatable whether or not that made it into Great Gatsby. There was a short story that he was writing at about the same time that was supposed to be a prologue to Great Gatsby that didn't make it in the novel. That was very Catholic, and it had to do with, it's called The Curious Case of Absolution, if anyone's interested in reading that. And it has to do with a little boy kind of giving his confession to a priest, and it's a really, really interesting story. So a lot of people point to, well, maybe he pulled out the Catholic element, but I would argue that through some of the symbolism, he absolutely includes some Catholic themes into the story, especially with Eckelberg kind of like being these eyes of God that are seeing everything. And as these people are passing kind of the rich, the new and the old rich of New and West Egg into the opulence of New York City, and they're passing through this Valley of Ashes, and that God sees all, right, and that's where kind of the climax of the story happens. Of course, with that, at that scene where there's the terrible accident that happens kind of right in front of these eyes, and Fitzgerald references that because one of the characters, George, after his, again, spoiler alert, George, after his wife is run over by a speeding car that Gatsby happens to be in, that Daisy's driving, he says, God is watching. So it's just really interesting, and I think it really epitomizes the moral and spiritual decay of the time,
Yeah.
that I don't think any other book does as well. And that's where I draw, a lot of parallels again to some of what you're referencing with Eliot. But it's the moral decay of the time, that he keeps going back to. And again, not to go even back further in time to Man Who Is Thursday, but I think there's an interesting parallel there of, there was a very specific point to that novel, right?
Yeah.
And there was a very specific point to this novel, is just to address the spiritual decline, of all of these, the emptiness of the parties, the emptiness of the jazz age, and Fitzgerald noticing all of this and not quite knowing what to do about it, or where to go. Um, if you're interested, if you're reading the book, of course, we've got the green light, which could mention a lot of things. We were always taught in high school that the green light represented hope, which, of course, if you're any reader of Shakespeare, you absolutely know that the green light is the green light of envy, which makes a lot of sense because Gatsby's looking across across the pond there, it is love that he can't get. But there's a lot of superficiality in the novel, and I think that's what makes it pretty beautiful. And I don't know if you want to dive now into some of the similarities that I think exist um, with the Man Who Is Thursday. But yeah, what are your thoughts at the end of Gatsby, and whether or not is Fitzgerald able to get to the point,
Hmm.
and does he make the point of this is an empty age and there has to be something more? Just kind of maybe your thoughts around that.
I think in precisely that modernist way that does frustrate Chesterton, right? So this is where I think we could pull in
Mm,
this again, critical Chesterton being critical of the age, not necessarily because of the superficial elements for Chesterton. Like, okay, he has a distaste for jazz, right? But it's about more than that. It's about he sees a lack of a kind of courage in this younger generation to like that they recognize the unmoored kind of existence that they're living, which is
mm,
why Father Brown says that great line that the bright young things don't even enjoy the
yeah.
jazzing. It's just they go through it with these mad and increasingly kind of frenetic motions. And that's the real tragedy of it. And it was a tragedy that Chesterton perceived. And I think that Fitzgerald, for my reading, I think he stews in that tragedy. So
Mm,
if you go back to like Eckelberg's eyes, the eyes watching over, you said that they're sort of like the eyes of God seeing all, and in another sense, though, they're sort of like eyes that are there watching but not seeing.
mm.
And I always thought of that as, especially because it's an advertising billboard, right?
Right.
And I think
A
that
decaying
Fitzgerald,
advertising billboard, right?
indeed, yeah,
It's fading. Yeah.
it's fading. It's the
Yep.
fading promise and allure of the American dream of rising capitalism, of the ability for a boy, a good old boy from the Midwest, to move to the city and make something of himself and
Sure.
become a made man. And gosh, Fitzgerald's great like this, like Evil and Wall. Wall was more on the nose. He named his characters things like Guy Crouchback and a gossip columnist named Miles Malpractice. But he, Fitzgerald, the guy's name is Caraway. He's sort of, to be carried away
Yeah.
is to not be necessarily driving yourself. And there's a lot of imagery of people being driven by someone else and driven into bad circumstances, disastrous circumstances, in cars that are speeding.
Yep.
All that is very, very deliberate in this novel. And it's also deliberate that what does Caraway go to New York to do? To sell bonds,
Yep.
or to sell bondage,
Right. Right.
as it were. So this is why the novel I think did have a commercial failure upon it coming out, because it was not a welcome message for the hopeful year of 1925. It was not something that people wanted to be told, that all this promise of a future, and the futurists are big at this time, and even the eugenicists, and there's subtle references in this book about, like, you can get any sort of thing at a pharmacy, to things like contraception,
Yep.
coming on online. So it's and you know in modern days, of course, the literary critics have gotten hold of it and they try to queer the novel. They try to make all these things out of it. But one thing that is definitely there, that I would like a good, solid, grounded person who writes on gender theory to approach in the novel, is that the relations of men and women are precisely one of the reasons that this generation was feeling lost. Because
Mm,
this is what Chesterton was criticizing in the suffragette movement and things like that. We trust us, viewers and listeners, if you're not already alienated. We won't go there, but we won't go into suffrage. But the point is that mixing of society that's happening, the breaking down of barriers, the sort of unmodesty of the way
mm,
that women and men are carrying on together. And I think that there's this sense that you get with Fitzgerald reading him, that man still wants a home. He wants children. He wants a wife.
mm.
He wants that home and that domestic castle to return to, but it takes two, and
Great. That's so
it's
great.
missing.
Yeah, and I think, not to go too deep into the imagery of the novel, but George and Myrtle Wilson, right? I think absolutely portray what you're talking about, because they're
Yep.
victims of capitalism, right? And
Hmm.
here's George trying to make his life in the Valley of Ashes, and he's not able to make, barely able to scrape enough money, as these rich people are kind of moving from West and East Egg over into New York City and just filling up their gas tank and their expensive cars, and he can barely scrape by. But it's his wife who then is having an affair with Tom Buchanan, who's one of the richest, and I would say probably the epitome of the hard nose in the jazz age, who thinks that all of
Uh,
this is right. He's the one who's
yeah.
just going after the money. He doesn't have any sort of a reconciled heart at all. Even at the end of the novel, it's he's really the worst, which I think is kind of in relation to Gregor in Man Who's Thursday. But we'll talk about that in a
Well,
second.
that significance too of Myrtle living above the garage, and
That's right.
Tom basically
That's right.
goes by
Yep.
to like
Yep.
take her out for a spin every once in a while. She's like a leisure vehicle for him.
Yep. That's right.
Instead of the wife that he has at home, she's sort of that race car that he occasionally likes to tool
Yeah.
around with. So
Yeah. Well, and to
it,
your point, so
yeah.
George was trying to get Myrtle to leave, right? He wanted to leave. Let's get a farm. Let's build our own house, our own family, away from all of this. So he was even recognizing that this is such a broken system, and to your point, is he was trying to sort of grab his family and bring it back to where it needed to be by leaving, by moving, right? And you could see a lot of Fitzgerald again in even that sentiment of, he was here, and it's like he's getting this pull of, I need to leave this place to be able to go back to the roots that I know, to build that family again. But of course it ends up ending in tragedy, because again, you can't, like you said perfectly, you can't do it without the husband and the wife, without both. And I think that just describes that. There's a lot of Zelda, I think, in Myrtle, and there's a lot of
Hmm.
Zelda in the relationship between Myrtle and George, right? Where they're kind of at odds with each other, but they love each other. And George would do anything for Myrtle, and is ultimately just completely, devastated at the loss of Myrtle after she was hit by the car. And at one point in time as well, Zelda went crazy, right? She was in an institution. She more or less completely lost her mind, and I think that's Fitzgerald kind of being a little prophetic, right, about his life, and about his marriage, and how that was broken. And it's just interesting to see how he's putting himself into each one of these little characters. The worst of him is Tom. The best of him is Nick. The reality of him is George and Myrtle Wilson. And so just pretty
Hmm.
interesting there. Yeah. Great. Let's talk a little bit about Chesterton. I ran across an essay. I don't know if you're familiar with it, "The Fallacy of Success," but Chesterton kind of goes at great length about success, and of course, Great Gatsby. We talked about Tom Buchanan and riches, and what it means to have a lot of money, and be able to put on this facade in front of people that you're rich and you can afford to not do anything all day and party all day. And Chesterton has some interesting things to say about that. Um, and I think this is a quote from The Fallacy of Success that I'll just read really quickly. "The whole of Christianity is that a man who is dependent upon the luxuries of this life is a corrupt man, spiritually corrupt, politically corrupt, financially corrupt. There is one thing that Christ and all the Christian saints have said with sort of savage monotony. They have said simply that to be rich is to be in peculiar danger of moral wreck." And you can see that so clearly in The Great Gatsby, as well as the people that are wrecked the most are the people that absolutely don't care at the end of the story. And so I would venture to say that that's probably Jordan and Tom Buchanan. Um, but that's where I think my parallels of Man Who Was Thursday comes in. If you're interested in kind of talking down that path a little bit. Again, we know that Fitzgerald and Chesterton were contemporaries. Fitzgerald has admitted to reading Chesterton and stealing ideas. There's this great quote that I'll read really quickly of Fitzgerald and some of his writings. "I want to be able to do anything with words, handle slashing, flaming descriptions like Wells, and use the paradox with the clarity of Samuel Butler, the breadth of Bernard Shaw, and the wit of Oscar Wilde. I want to do the wide, sultry heavens of Conrad, the rolled gold sundowns of crazy quilt skies of Hitchens and Kipling, as well as the pastel dawns and twilights of Chesterton. All this is by way of example. As a matter of fact, I'm a professed literary thief, hot after the best methods of every writer in my generation. Which I think is great because there's a couple of times that Fitzgerald is mentioning that that Chesterton is a great writer. And actually, that reminds me of another quote I'll just read really quickly. I don't know if you saw it in the notes here, but this is Fitzgerald in a letter to one of his literary friends, Shane Leslie. Did you ever notice that remarkable coincidence? Bernard Shaw is 61 years old. Wells is 51 years old. G.K. Chesterton, 41. You're 31, and I'm 21. All the great writers of the world, an arithmetical progression, which I think is pretty bold of Fitzgerald. That even when he was a pretty young buck at 21, he was comparing himself to, to Wells and Chesterton and Shaw. And I don't think the math quite adds up there. It's pretty close, but I think it's pretty interesting. And I would say that the symbolism that Fitzgerald talks about, or that he utilizes in The Great Gatsby, is in line with some of the symbolism that we see, that just the blatant symbolism that we see in The Man Who Is Thursday, which is why
Hmm.
I think whenever I've read this novel, I always remember The Man Who Is Thursday as a specific goal. You've got these people that are just absolutely wearing masks, and it's not till the end of the novel that all of these masks kind of come off. Right? Daisy herself in Great Gatsby realizes that her mask is that she's just going along with the flow with Tom, and she can't be without him because that's where the money is. Right? Gatsby himself builds up an entire facade of his entire being. From the house that he owns to the cars, it's all fake. Right? And I think that's pretty clear as well in what we see with The Man Who Is Thursdays. We've got all of these people that are, like you said perfectly, are coming together wanting to live inside of this kind of jazz age of opulence, but at the same time they all don't. And they're the ones that are recognizing themselves that there's something broken here, save for Tom. Right? And then I would say in The Man Who Was Thursday, everyone's kind of dropping their masks, and they realize that they're, spoiler alert, if you haven't read Man Who Was Thursday, you probably should. But they're all realizing that they're not who they should be, save Gregory, right? Who's the only one that's kind of like, wait a second, no, I'm the only real anarchist here. So I think it's an interesting parallel between the two. Dale on Dale Alquist here on our website talking about The Man Who Is Thursday in Lecture 10. I think this is pretty interesting and relates as well to The Man Who Is Thursday. This quote from Dale in this lecture. But it's not just bomb throwers who are the anarchists and the enemies of the common man. There is another class of people dedicated to a more deceitful destruction of the society. They too think they can live outside the rules. I mean, this is perfect. This is Great Gatsby right here.
Yeah.
They are the very rich. The poor object to being governed badly. The rich object to being governed at all. And I think you can see that really clearly in Great Gatsby, is this idea of this superficial freedom, right? Just because you have all of the money and the power, and you've set yourself up as maybe not being the person that follows the rules at the end, that's what gets them, right? Is that they have to follow the rules because there's something there that's pulling them. And for Nick, it was the Midwest. It was pulling him back. For Gatsby, who ends in kind of ultimate demise. We should talk about that in a separate podcast. Kind of this ultimate Holocaust that people call it. Actually, what Fitzgerald calls it in the book.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting, kind of the use of symbolism, and I do wonder just your take on that, because I don't think there's a lot of people that would be a proponent of this, but I do wonder if the usage of symbolism in both The Great Gatsby and The Man Who Is Thursday, knowing that Fitzgerald was a fan of A Man Who Is Thursday, I see a lot of parallels there. I've not totally fleshed them out, but I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, yeah, really hard to say. I mean, I think that The Man Who Was Thursday reads more traditionally as a not well, sort of an allegory. Chesterton calls it a nightmare. I guess the technical term for it would be a romanathem, right? Not a, so Romana Clef is a novel that is openly satirical, and this represents that. This represents that. Romanathem is a little more morally driven. It's almost like an everyman tale, and things are stand-ins, and the 7 days of creation, etc. Um, I think though that in his reading of Chesterton, both novels, but probably poetry that Fitzgerald would have come across. He certainly would have been formed in his sort of Catholic imagination, and he does in that. I think it's in or well through the voice of a character in The Side of Paradise calls Chesterton a prophet, and that particular kind of prophecy that was full of this sort of rich meaning and symbolism, and so I think that on the one hand, yes, it's Chesterton. On the other hand, it's just this is sort of we spoke about this recently on the podcast with a guest, Ben Reinhardt from Steubenville, from Franciscan, on J.R.R. Tolkien and what it means to sort of have this sort of Catholic imagination. This is what it is. It's sort of in the air you breathe. It's you end up looking at the world in a certain way, and smoke rising now from a chimney can't but sort of call a thurible to mind.
Yeah.
Once you're raised in it. So uh, yeah, I need to think more about that myself. To be honest with you, the direct parallels may be over. I think the other great one that may be worth your consideration would be, although I'd have to check the years to see whether it even falls in there. Not as a direct influence, maybe, but just as an interesting parallel would be The Man Who Knew Too Much
Yeah.
by
Sure.
Chesterton. That you kind of have this figure who is trapped in that place, and this is one of the great debates in Gatsby, right? Is who's does anybody end up really being honorable? Because Gatsby is in many ways the best and the worst of them,
Yeah.
himself. So that's an interesting kind of thing to play with too, because that's, I would argue, The Man Who Knew Too Much. He's sort of the best and the
Yeah.
worst in a
No,
certain
that's
way.
that's an
Um,
interesting parallel. Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Gatsby too is he was described as having being godlike, in the Great Gatsby,
yeah.
which is really interesting because he's the creator of kind of his own life. It didn't have anything to do with where he grew up, and he was a Midwest kid as well, I believe, is the background for Gatsby. And again, if you haven't read um, that short story that was supposed to be the prequel, you probably should, because I think some people tend to think that that was maybe the story of Gatsby before he started creating this persona outside of himself. And also, just to kind of again not lean too much into The Man Who Is Thursday, but Fitzgerald himself at one point did describe the Great Gatsby as a nightmare of the age, which I think is a pretty interesting way to look about it. So kind of wonder again, like that example that I read to you earlier, that he's a professed literary thief. He was probably taking a lot of these little elements from some of his, some of his favorite authors and wanting to make him his own, which I think is pretty interesting. Yeah.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's a good one. I need to look at the Man Who Knew Too Much. It'd be interesting to draw those parallels on it as well. And just you mentioned something that kind of made me think of sort of, I guess, the two paths that that Chesterton and Fitzgerald go in addressing the age, right? And I think what you see with Chesterton is this kind of this hopefulness, and what you see in Fitzgerald is not being able to grapple with the hopefulness and the despair of the age, where Chesterton was able to do so. And I don't know if that's where we get into kind of a paradox land of things, but and maybe for if people are tuning in just because of the Great Gatsby, just explain really quickly the idea of a paradox, and this is where I really think Chesterton is a lot more successful, where
Hmm.
Fitzgerald just wasn't able to handle two different sides of things.
I agree. I think that Chesterton had a more thoroughly um, faithful view, and a view that was aided by that divine faith, that ended up being able to not just have the imagination to see, which is, I think, what the Catholic formation does give to Fitzgerald,
Hmm.
but then kind of the belief that, because it's one thing to say that suffering leads to a better good, or that suffering can be redemptive. It's another thing to really believe that and to really live it out and to really experience it, and I think that you know uh, at the risk of sounding you know too reliant, that or as some people would think, too reliant on grace. It really is the operation of grace in a life. I just don't know how else you can square it, because Chesterton had great suffering in his life. He witnessed the death of his brother in the war. He witnessed all manner of horrors, and yet, you know, he never was even really tempted to
Mm.
despair. So uh, yeah, I think that made all the difference.
I think that I think that's a great point. Even himself. So Fitzgerald wrote. He compiled a bunch of writings that he had, some letters, some other articles that he had read for that he had written for a magazine, and he put it together in sort of a little volume called the Crack Up, which is really at the point where Fitzgerald is literally cracking up.
Yeah.
He's having nervous breakdowns. And it's some really interesting writings at this point. This was well after Great Gatsby. He's on his way to writing one of his last novels. But this really interesting quote that's always stuck with me is the test of a first rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
Mm.
And I think what's interesting about that is you can see where Fitzgerald, in one hand, was absolutely living out the jazz age. Like he was in it. He was, he and Zelda were the power couple of the jazz age in New York City. But he also had this opposing view of what I'm looking into is the moral decay and decline of society. And he, I think, admits it himself. The test of a first rate intelligence. Not saying that Fitzgerald was not intelligent, but I think he's even admitting to it that he's got these two opposing views and these two opposing ideas, and he didn't have the ability to retain his function at that point.
Yeah.
He was so conflicted, right, that it literally led to him absolutely going kind of insane. He would take his temperature hourly, right, and record his temperature. He was constantly feeling ill. He was a
Yeah.
drunk. So there were these manifestations of him just absolutely falling apart because he couldn't grapple with what he considered his Midwest roots, maybe the foundation of not only his family life and his past, but maybe his spiritual foundation in St. Paul, Minnesota, right? And that which he was living out elsewhere on the East Coast. And I think in the Crack Up, just in that quote, he gives a really gives us kind of a clear insight into his mind is he lost the ability to function. He
Mm.
wasn't able to see a paradox, right, and kind of look at both ends of it and come out hopeful, like you're saying with Chesterton. And I love how you put that, because I think just in thinking about Fitzgerald and maybe trying to give him more credit than he's due, or maybe he is due it, is it really is just a product of grace, and that's something that Chesterton did have, and then I think Fitzgerald maybe was always grappling for. Um, his daughter Scotty, she was baptized Catholic. His mother was actually sending him Chesterton books, which I think this is really interesting as well. In 1930, I think it is, he was writing letters back and forth to his mother. So Zelda's in an institution in Europe, and they're living in Paris at the time with his daughter. And he writes to his mother, "Hey, thanks for the Chesterton." It's around 1930. So I think that puts that in the time period of um, maybe Everlasting Man. I'm not quite sure where that would have landed, but I kind of think I'm a little hopeful that his mother would have sent him this great new work by Chesterton, and maybe it was something that Fitzgerald read and was starting to kind of bring him back down to earth a little bit. Um, it's hard to tell, but interesting to kind of think about.
Well, absolutely, worth thinking about more, and I hope that this has been a teaser. I think we kind of need to wrap up, but we're
Sure.
almost at the hour mark. But for the viewers and listeners, we hope that this was an interesting conversation for you. There's Lee put down a lot of notes. I had some things written down. I'll tell you what, we might even at some point here maybe record like a bonus episode if you're interested in that. We'll pop it on. The only way you'll get that is if you're subscribers on our YouTube channel. So like this video, hit the subscription button, hit the notification bell to get a notification, and if we drop that or anything like that in the future, you'll be able to get it. As Lee mentioned, we'll be having a few more conversations about kind of great literary figures as we approach the conference. We'll be talking about those subjects of other talks at the conference coming up. Walker Percy, Sigrid Undset, perhaps Sir Walter Scott. So a lot of cool conversations like this. But if you'd like other conversations like this, just about sort of Chesterton and his milieu, his contemporaries, and the similarities and differences, please drop us a note in the comments or write to podcast@chesterton.org. Lee, before we wrap up, any last words of wisdom or any last messages you want to leave the audience with?
I think we can go into some more details a little bit later, maybe in a bonus episode. But I think I'll leave it with what Cardinal Boehm said back in 1975 when they reburied F. Scott Fitzgerald in the
Fitzgerald,
Catholic
yeah.
cemetery, because I think it really kind of describes F. Scott Fitzgerald as well, and kind of everything that came out of that. So I'll go ahead and read that. F. Scott Fitzgerald came out of the Maryland Catholic tradition. He was a man touched by the faith of the Catholic Church. There can be perceived in his work a Catholic consciousness of reality. He found in this faith an understanding of the human heart caught in the struggle between grace and death. His characters are involved in the great drama, seeking God and seeking love. As an artist, he was able with lucidity and poetic imagery to portray this struggle. He also experienced in his own life the mystery of suffering and, we hope, the power of God's grace.
Well, yes, indeed. Let's say a prayer for that, especially with our theme this year, the Saints Go Marching In, that we hope to join in that number, and we hope that maybe we'll meet F. Scott Fitzgerald there, and maybe, as the song suggests, it might be a kind of a jazz march, jazz parade. So we'll see what Chesterton has to say about that. But thank you, Lee, for a fascinating discussion. I think there's more to say, and I think we'll maybe take an opportunity to say it. I will find that interesting. I'm not sure who else will, but this is just a great opportunity. And if you're out there in Chesterton world, and your kids maybe don't go to a Chesterton high school, and they're being asked to take on The Great Gatsby this year in their class, you can maybe share this with them, and it will
Do it with
help
confidence.
open up the novel with that. That's
Yep.
right. All right. Well, thanks, Lee, again. This is great.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for all of you for tuning in. Please do try to join us for great conversations like this in person in New Orleans in July. You can find out more about that at chesterton.org/conference. In the meantime, though, stay tuned here, whether you're on a podcast app or on YouTube, for our next episode, which we drop these every Tuesday. As I said, make sure to hit the bell in case we drop anything in the meantime. And please do share this episode with your friends, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. God bless.
If I call you old sport more than once, call it out.
See how many people get the reference. Yeah.
Lord, I gotta wanna be in that number.